Welcome to Landscape Photo Editing Sessions. I'm Rayate Arkiri. In this episode, I'm going to be editing a Milky Way photo taken with a longer lens. So I took this with a 30mm lens on a crop body, so it's equivalent to around 45mm on a full frame body. Alright, so I'm going to get started. I have it open in Lightroom. First, I'm going to enable profile corrections for this lens. So I'm using a Sigma 30mm 1.4 DN lens for the Sony a6000. So I'm going to enable that, and that removes the distortion and vignette. I'm going to go back to the basic adjustments and start adjusting the contrast and color. So I want to make this a bit more contrasty and boost up the color of the Milky Way and fix the color balance. So first thing, I want to add a bit more contrast. So I'm gonna bump up the white just until there's a little bit of clipping, so that's okay. So 30, and then I'm gonna take down the blacks, and then I'm gonna increase the contrast just a little bit, and it's slightly bright, so I'm gonna just take down the exposure a little bit too. Alright, the next thing, I want to increase the vibrance quite a bit. 36, it's a good amount, and then I'm gonna fix the white balance, but before that I'm gonna increase the saturation all the way so that I can easily see what colors I'm affecting. So right now there's a lot of green in the lower part, so this is where there might be some air glow, so the green tint. So I want to make it more purple or magenta, so I'm going to balance it out. So adding more magenta in the top part of the Milky Way, and there's still a little bit of green left, so that's good. And regarding the blue, it's pretty good right now, as it was. So I'm going to keep it that way. And I'm going to take the saturation down and just bring it down to 12, so the Milky Way is nice and saturated. And I'm going to do a little bit of noise reduction. So if I go into the corners, there's a lot of noise, especially with the vignette removed as the exposure was lifted a little bit in the corner. So I'm going to increase the noise reduction to around maybe 25 for the luminance. And then for the color, there's a lot of color noise, so I'm going to increase that to around 60, and also increase the smoothness to around 70. So that's much better now. So I took a few more photos for the Milky Way and 2 photos for the foreground, and I'm going to combine them. So this was a long exposure, so to get the shadow detail, as it was no moon out, so there wasn't much detail in the shadows unless I did a long exposure. So I'm going to copy and paste the settings using Control-Shift-C. I'm going to copy the settings, all of them, and then paste them to the rest of the photos. Control-Shift-V to paste them. Alright, that's good. So with these 3 Milky Way photos, I'm going to stack them. It's going to average out the random noise pattern by stacking them. And then for these 2, I'm also going to stack them a little bit. So I want to bring up the brightness on this one. And I want to bring the blacks up and the shadows up a little bit to get more detail in the shadows. So that's around a good brightness. And then same thing with this one. So I'm going to copy the settings since I just changed them. Paste it. This one's a bit too bright, so I'm going to bring that down. I want these to be the same brightness. Alright, that looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and open all these layers in Photoshop, opening them as layers in one document. Alright, so I have them open in Photoshop. I'm going to go ahead and hide the Milky Way layers, and I'm going to work on the foreground layers. So to stack them, I simply have to average out the opacities. So I'm going to change the opacity of this layer to 50%, and that will average out the random noise pattern. So if I hide this layer a little bit, or hide this layer, it's slightly more noisy, but if I enable it with the 50% opacity, it allows the random noise pattern to kind of cancel it out a little bit, and a bit more detail appears. So there's a lot of these hot noise, so I'm gonna fix that by using a filter, but first I'm gonna merge these two layers. So merge layers, and then go to filter, noise, and the trick to this one is using dust and scratches filter with a low radius. So I'm going to try one first. I usually keep the threshold around 40. And then, so it needs more radius, so 2 pixels. Let's try that. So almost all of it is gone, so I'm going to try 3 pixels and see how that looks. Alright, that's pretty good. So it got rid of most of those hot pixels and without taking away any of the detail, the actual detail in the photo. And I'm going to take a step further and add a subtract layer. So what this is basically a layer with the same settings I took. So the foreground was around 360 seconds, f1.4 at ISO 800, so I just did that with the lens cap. And the hot pixels are always in the same location, so by basically using a dark frame I can subtract only the hot pixels out. So I'm going to open this and bring it into the layer or the photo. I'm going to rasterize it, and then I'm going to change the blending mode to subtract. So if I go in here, it does remove the rest of the hot pixels if there are any, but it's also removing a lot of detail, and the problem with that is the exposure might be a little bit too bright. So I'm going to add a curve adjustment and create a clipping mask so that it only affects this layer and bring the brightness down. So I don't want it to lose any detail, so I'm going to bring it down a bit more. I think that was too much. Alright, that's pretty good. So I'm not really losing detail, and it's also removing the rest of the hot pixels or any remnants of it. I'm going to go ahead and merge these layers since I'm done with it. The next thing I want to do is add in these photos. But first I'm going to stack these photos. So there's a slight movement as the Earth rotates. So the stars appear to move. And I want to align them so that I can stack them without having any trails, star trails. So I'm going to mask out the foreground by adding a layer mask using a black brush. I'm going to increase the hardness to 100% and size up the brush. And then I'm going to brush out the foreground. So I'm just going to do a quick job. I don't have to do a really detailed selection. And I just copied the layer mask to the other layers by holding down Alt and just dragging the layer mask up to the other layers. So now I can select the layers and go to auto align. So edit, auto align layers, and just leave it on auto. And Photoshop should do a decent job of getting it aligned. So now the Milky Way is aligned. There's a slight movement in the corner, but that doesn't matter too much. It won't be too visible. So I'm going to go ahead and delete these masks. And then adjust the opacities of the layer to layer average them. So I'm going to change the second layer to 50% and the third layer to 33%. And if I zoom in here, you're going to see a pretty big difference. So one layer, and then that's a lot noisier, but as I stack the extra 2 layers, it cancels out the random noise patterns and making it much better, much cleaner image. So the problem now is that the auto align slightly tilted or rotated the image, and now if I hide these, it's kind of making trails in the foreground, and I don't want that. So what I'm gonna do is mask out these 2 top layers. So I'm just gonna use a black brush. I'm gonna make the soft hardness down to 0, size down the brush, and then just mask out these areas, a slight edge over here to get rid of the trail, the trailing foreground. And then I'm gonna go ahead and copy this to the other layer. And now I have a slightly noisy edge. So what I'm gonna do is duplicate the bottom layer. I'm gonna apply a noise reduction in Camera Raw. So I'm gonna go to the Camera Raw filter. I'm gonna go to my noise reduction tab. I'm going to zoom in here and just put a lot of noise reduction, make it around the same level as the noise over here. So that's pretty good. And then I want to add a black layer mask. I hold down Alt while pressing the layer mask button, and then I'm just going to mask in the edge with the noise, the more noisy part. So the edge is just gonna be 1 layer, but it just has extra noise reduction, and that won't really be visible in the photo unless you try to look really hard. Alright, that looks pretty good. The next thing I want to do is mask out all these layers. But first I'm just going to go ahead and merge these. And I'm going to take the selection from the foreground. It's a lot easier to select. So I'm just going to use the quick selection tool. I'm going to size it up a little bit and select out the sky. I'm going to zoom in here. So I have these trees over here and I want to get a good selection of those. So I'm going to do that by using the Refine Edge tool. And I go into my black and white view. And then I'm going to increase the radius to automatically detect the edge of the pixels. Alright, so 3 pixel radius is pretty good. And I also want to paint out the areas that have trees. So I'm going to go change the view to reveal layer and then paint it along the areas that have little spaces between the trees. So this brush would automatically detect those spaces and mask them out. So alright, so if I show it on the black and white layers, you can see that brush did a good job of getting rid of those spaces. I'm going to increase the feather just a little bit and increase the contrast just a little bit too. Alright, so I'm going to output that to a selection, and then I'm going to select make this layer visible, the Milky Way layer, and apply the mask simply by clicking on the layer mask button, and it automatically applies the selected layer mask. So that just did a really good job of selecting that out. And if I zoom in here, it's a pretty decent selection, but it could be a bit better. So I'm going to clean it up a little bit. I'm going to clean it up by going into my tools over here. I'm going to mask the edge a bit more. So I'm going to go to mask edge, and I'm just going to shift the edge a bit out just so that I can get less of the selection from the bottom layer that's making the edges too bright. So if I go back, that made the edges too bright. So that's why I want to increase the edge. And okay. So that's pretty good. I'm also going to increase the feather just a little bit, so that'll smooth it out. Alright, so that's looking pretty good. I'm going to check the edge. Alright, I'm happy with that. That's a good selection. Did a good job. Next thing, I want to get rid of these little color splotches over here. So that must have been from the high contrast areas. And then I'm just going to use the spot healing brush tool and see how that does. Alright, it's doing a good job. So I'm just going to remove the rest of these edges that have a bit of color. Alright, that's pretty good. And go ahead and crop this. Alright, so I've successfully blended the foreground and the Milky Way, and it's looking pretty good so far. So I want to make a few adjustments. So the first adjustment I want to make is adding in a bit more contrast in the foreground. I want to make the darker parts a bit darker, and then I really like this part over here, the smooth rock. So I want to accentuate the brighter parts of the foreground, and I'm just going to do that by adding a curve adjustment. I'm going to go ahead and make a point near the top and bring it out a lot, and then bring a point near the bottom and bring it down to make an S curve. So I want to darken out the foreground just a little bit, not too much. Alright, so that added a bit of darkness over here. Alright. And it's adding a lot of color using this mask, so I'm going to change it so that it only affects the brightness values. So by changing the blending mode to luminosity, it won't affect the color of this layer. I'm noticing it's kind of making a weird effect on the edge because it's adding more contrast. So I'm going to go ahead and mask out the edge with a black brush. Soft brush, okay. And I'm just going to mask out. Okay. So I'm going to mask that out. Alright, that's pretty good. And I think I want to darken those trees a little bit. So I'm going to bring down and create another curve adjustment and bring down the brightness. I'm going to invert that with Control I and then paint it on with white and a low opacity, so around 30%. And just going to brush that multiple strokes just to brighten down those trees, those brighter areas. And maybe over here too. Alright, that's better. So I'm about done with the foreground, and now I want to adjust the Milky Way layer. And first I want to get rid of these weird, there must be some aberrations from the lens. And there's also some coma, so which are these weird shaped stars, or the corner of the lens causes the light to bend in a different way, causing those wing-shaped coma. That's what it's called, wing-shaped stars. So I can fix that by using a spot healing brush and just painting it around on the star. And that does a pretty decent job of fixing that. So I'm just going to do that with any of the stars that are noticeable. Another method of doing it is to use a donut shaped brush with the spot healing or the clone stamping tool. So I'm just going to do that instead because I'm having a hard time with these stars over here. So I'm going to size it down to around the size of the star. And then just brush those on. Alright, there we go. Okay, so I got most of the stars that had chromatic aberration, and it's much better now. The next thing I want to do is increase the contrast in the Milky Way. So I'm just going to add a curve adjustment, create a clipping mask so that it only affects the Milky Way layer. I'm going to use the targeted adjustment tool and go to the brightest part of the Milky Way, so around here. I'm going to bring that up just a tad and then go to the darkest part of the Milky Way, so around here, and bring that down. Alright, so that looks pretty good. And that's almost done with the Milky Way. So I'm going to add one more layer for color. So I want more red in this bright part over here. So I'm going to use Luminosity Mask to only select the bright part of this Milky Way. So I'm going to go ahead and create the Luminosity Mask. And then I'm going to go to my channels, go to my brights. I'm going to go ahead and adjust the levels or the curve on this so that it only selects the part of the Milky Way. So the bright parts I want to select. And that's pretty good. So only the white or brighter parts are going to be selected. So I'm going to go ahead, select that, create a new curve adjustment. It'll automatically apply that mask. I'm also going to apply the clipping mask so that it only affects. I'm going to go ahead and apply the clipping mask so that it only affects the Milky Way layer. And then I'm going to change the blending mode to color so that it only affects the color. I'm going to go to my red channel and go to the bright part and just bring it up a little bit. That's pretty good. I'm just going to go to the dark part and bring that down so that it doesn't affect any of the midtones or highlights. I mean the shadows, midtones or shadows. So if I toggle this layer on and off, I think it needs a bit more. Alright, a little bit less. Okay, that's pretty good. So it's a subtle adjustment, making the bright part a bit more red. The next thing I want to do is add a slight vignette around the image. So I want the viewer's eye to focus on the Milky Way and a little bit on the foreground over here. So I'm just going to add a vignette to the whole image. I'm just going to use a curve adjustment. I'm going to bring it down and I'm going to invert that. Control I, use a large black brush with a low opacity. I'm going to size that up. And then just brush around the edges where I want it to be darker. So I'm going to bring down the opacity a little more. And then just go around the image in multiple passes. It's getting a bit too dark in this area of the foreground. So I'm just going to brush that black a little bit. Alright. And that's pretty good. I'm just going to bring down the opacity just to make the adjustment a little bit less stronger. Okay, that looks pretty good. And finally, I'm going to add a color adjustment to the whole image. So I'm going to create new curve adjustment, make it change the blending mode to color, go to my blue channel, and I want to add more blue to the dark areas. So I'm going to bring that up, that lower point. I also want less blue in the highlights, so I'm going to bring that down. And that adds a nice, takes away some of that warmer tones in the shadows. And I really like how that looks. And then next thing I want to do is add a bit of a origin effect in the Milky Way. So that will kind of soften up the hardness. So I'm going to go ahead and create a clone stamp of all the layers visible. So Control, Alt, Shift, and E. That'll create a clone. And then I'm gonna apply a Gaussian blur. Around 20 is good. I'm gonna change the opacity to 15%. I'm gonna create a curve adjustment to create the glow, and create a clipping mask just so that it only affects the origin effect layer, or the glow effect. I'm gonna create an S curve. Just mainly brightening it up a little bit and bring the shadows down just a little bit too. That looks pretty good. And I don't want it to be in the foreground, so I'm going to mask it out of the foreground. So I'm going to add a layer mask, use a black brush, and then just mask it out. So I'm going to do the edge first. Oh, I forgot to make my opacity 100%. So here we go. Then I'm gonna go press Alt onto the layer mask, hold down Alt so I can see what I painted. I'm just gonna use the polygonal lasso tool to select out the foreground. And fill it. Alt, press, and delete. And that will fill it with a foreground color. Alright, so now it's out of the foreground. And it looks pretty good. So one effect that I used for my final image is I got rid of the a lot of the stars, because I want to focus more on the actual colors and the detail of the those gases and stuff in the Milky Way. So I can do that by creating a clone stamp, and by using the dust and scratches I can actually create that effect. So notice how it's removing the stars, but I want to keep my threshold back a little bit more, and maybe 10 threshold, so that adds a bit more of the stars and then small details back in, and it really allows you to focus more on the smaller or the bigger stars and more detail in the Milky Way. So that's a big difference. And I'm just going to lower the opacity just to let in some of the stars back in. So I wouldn't do this effect if I was actually printing this large, but if I actually resize it to smaller size, so if I resizing this for the web, 1200 pixels wide. So if I hide this layer, there's a lot of details, smaller stars, and I don't think it really looks good. But by having that layer that takes away a lot of the smaller stars, it allows you to focus more on the bigger stars and also a lot more on the Milky Way itself. So that's just a trick I used. So I'm gonna go back. All right. So that's basically it. Now go ahead. I first processed the photos in Lightroom. I then averaged out the foreground layers and then masked out, auto aligned, masked out the Milky Way layer. I also stacked the 3 layers for the Milky Way. And then went ahead and did some small adjustments in the trees over here, and then added a more contrast in the foreground itself. Then I added more contrast in the Milky Way, and then added more red in the bright part of the Milky Way using a luminosity mask. I added a vignette to pull the viewer's eye towards the Milky Way, away from the edges, just to darken the edges. I added an overall color grade, so adding more blue to the shadows, or taking away blue to the highlights. Added a bit of a glow effect for the sky. And finally, an optional, depending on what I'm going to use the image for, removing some of the stars. So it looks like I went back too far, but the dust and scratches effect to remove some of the smaller stars, and it adds a really nice effect. Alright, if you found this useful, please give it a like and comment if you have any questions, and consider subscribing if you haven't done so already. And thanks for watching.